Okay, so we're going to talk about heart disease and diabetes today. I've decided to I think this is a better flow with our the direction we're going. I oh my God, it's working now. Okay, great. Oh my goodness. That's awesome. Okay, so let's look at how many deaths. This is in the United States. What year is this? I think this was 2023. Okay. This is everybody, of course. We've kind of looked at the differences between age groups and, right, like heart disease for someone who is a teenager, even in their 20s, probably congenital, right? Meaning they were born with something. But in the United States, we look at causes of death. Heart disease is massive. It is massive, especially as you get older than 50, right? Um, Meaning clogging of the arteries, clogging of like main arteries and pathways for your blood to flow, right? Of course, we see cancer. And then again, I want you to keep in mind as I go through this that there are certain populations that really largely define all of this, right? So if we look at for your age group, unintended injuries, this graph would be very different. And this would be at the very top with homicide, suicide, right? So this is predominantly people who are older who have chronic stress to the body, environmental stress. Okay. So let's learn about it for a little bit. You get to listen to this cardiovascular doctor.
Common heart disease in the United States. CAD happens when coronary arteries struggle to supply the heart with enough blood, oxygen, and nutrients. Cholesterol deposits or plaques are almost always to blame. These buildups narrow your arteries, decreasing blood flow to your heart. This can cause chest pain, shortness of breath, or even a heart attack. CAD typically takes a long time to develop. So often, patients don't know they have it until there's a problem. But there are ways to prevent coronary artery disease, ways to know if you're at risk, and ways to treat it. Anyone can develop CAD. It begins when fats, cholesterols, and other substances gather along the walls of your arteries. This process is called atherosclerosis, and it's typically no cause for concern. However, too much buildup can lead to a blockage, obstructing blood flow. There are a number of risk factors, common red flags that can contribute to this and ultimately lead to coronary artery disease. First, getting older can mean more damage in narrow arteries. Second, men are generally at a greater risk, but the risk for women increases after menopause. Existing health conditions matter too. High blood pressure can thicken your arteries, narrowing your blood flow. High cholesterol levels can increase the rate of plaque buildup. Diabetes is also associated with higher risk, as is being overweight. Your lifestyle plays a large role as well. Physical inactivity, long periods of unrelieved stress in your life, an unhealthy diet, and smoking can all increase your risk. And finally, family history. If a close relative was diagnosed at an early age with heart disease, you're at a greater risk. All these factors together can paint a picture of your risk for developing CAD.
I'm going to stop it right there really quick. Okay, so I want you to recognize that if we looked at this, we could change kind of the distance that we can see this. He's describing very close viewpoint, very individualistic, like very myopic, way in and just looking at these itty bitty little things. Okay. So if we were to rewind a little bit, let me go back to this picture. These factors, age, gender, health conditions, high blood pressure. I want you to know something really quick. Remember when we talk about fight or flight and that breakdown of glycogen and that release of blood sugar into the bloodstream, And that when you're in fight or flight, your blood pressure goes up. It's about shunting blood to the muscles away from, right, away from your gut and away from your digestion to really supply what your body needs at the muscular level, right? To run, fight, or flight. So when you have high amounts of fear or anger, those two in particular emotions, those two emotions, fear and anger, are very, very powerful stimulants of that breakdown of glycogen and release in blood sugar. So when you look at high blood pressure, you don't have to have clogged arteries to have high blood pressure. It's actually a very healthy reaction to perceived threat, right? When your blood sugar goes up, right, and keep in mind that blood sugar also stimulates leptin, which also allows that fat fueling capacity to be available. You may end up, if your blood sugar gets too high, with higher amounts of cholesterol. To protect the brain, your body sends LDL, HDL cholesterol to go grab sugar, and it converts those, that the glucose strands get converted into a glycerol strand that protects the brain from having too high blood sugar, right? So then you end up with higher amounts of cholesterol. So even if you didn't eat something super fatty or even super carbohydrate wise, if you're just at rest in fight or flight, you could have higher blood pressure. You could have higher cholesterol because of that. How the body's trying to work off maybe some of the blood sugar you didn't use fleeing or fighting. Does that make sense? So these are all like the end result of a bigger picture. And they do not tell you societal things, right? They don't tell you that if you're in rage and anger and fear, you're probably going to have also signs of diabetes, right? Because your blood sugar may be higher. Now, you may not have like damaged cells at the pancreas that would promote type 2 diabetes as a permanent problem, but you're going to show signs of high resting blood sugar just for the sheer fact that you are under stress. Okay. And then in the end, all of this results in increased adipose tissue, which to the body, remember, is surviving. It's supposed to do that. It's basically saying, hey, we're in fight or flight. We don't necessarily can eat right now. We need to devote our energy to exercise our limbs, fleeing, fighting, hiding, fawning, whatever we need to do. So let's produce more body fat cells, higher leptin levels, higher insulin, higher, right? Blood sugar to make sure that we have adequate fueling reservoirs over time. And that body fat then produces more and more leptin as you gain more fat cells. Does that make sense? So we're kind of tying this into last week's and the weeks before view of what's going on in the body. You do not have to eat a ton of food. However, when we look at eating patterns in the United States, when we add the conversation about those survival needs for food, do I have access? Can I get more? Is it enough? Is it safe? Right? I want you to consider what population those things would be insecure with. And that remember, if you feel insecure with food, the probability you are going to overconsume when you get access is really high, right? So what population, based on what I'm describing, I'm going to have you guys make a guess, do you think is at most risk for cardiovascular disease and all of these individual level risk factors? Make a guess.
Low income and low education.
Yeah, they can have a higher education, does not matter. Low income, period. That makes sense? But it kind of goes hand in hand, right? Because education is a power way to try to get access to resources, jobs, opportunity, right? You're all here probably because you are very aware of that connection, right? So we can look at the United States across the board, take out all this individual shit, and we can go, oh, who's at risk? And we're going to see the poor population. So really quick, let's look at cardiovascular disease, United States map. Let's see, what year is this? I kind of like to be as current as possible. There's 2022. Oh, that's heart disease death rates different. Okay. Here we go. Predominantly, right? Probably in poorer areas. Now, there's a lot that goes into it. I'm just describing the impact that immediately, doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter. When you're under fight or flight, it makes you more sensitive to everything, right? Sensitive to all sorts of things. Your food, stress, perceptions are more sensitive, right? Let's just say you are in an insecurity, right, with food, and you have access to supersized fast food, right? Because you're hungry, right? Think of those, again, survival desires to eat that our current food system provides for. Very high calorie content, very low nutritional content, but the ability to feed that part of us primally that is seeking to feel safe with how much we have, when we have it, right? It's not just the food, but it's our human instinct to survive with food that is being paired with these things. So if all we do is demonize big food, big agriculture, you are missing it. You're missing it. Okay. So when you look at this map, this one, where's men? Let's look at men. You see that? That's a dated, it's 10 years old. But you can kind of see we're dealing with where the most amount of poverty exists in the country, right? I have let's see here. You guys get the gist? Okay. I want you to just keep that in mind because a lot of the, information out there about cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, very much you're like looking at it in a microscope and you're not looking at, oh, let's look at the big picture. Let's look at our structures, our systems, wealth disparities. Let's look at those social determinants of health that really policies that are in play around food and agriculture policies that determine what's in our food, right? That makes it more ultra processed, quicker to digest. The fact that those foods are very convenient for people who have food insecurity. And then it's very predictable, the stress loads on top of that biologically that they have prior to even eating that would make their bodies over decades very sensitive to this kind of disease. And it's not just for those who are struggling with food insecurity. We could also look at very high functioning men at really high stress load positions with all sorts of food security, and that they are not immune to stress and what happens over long periods of time. So let's talk about it. This is really interesting. So when I was your age, I'm not gonna lie, I was like, wah, 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 go work out, reduce your carbs. I mean, seriously. But I want you to pay attention to this because this actually matters. You might have parents who are on medication or grandparents or someone in your family that might have heart disease. And matters because their risk of stroke, their risk of heart attack is higher. So what happens over time, as that physician described, is the plaque buildup on the arteries. Plaque is to some degree very healthy, very normal, right? Cholesterol is a very important delivery system in our bodies. We're going to talk about that in a second. What happens though when that plaque gets sticky, and it's often sticky when it's attached to glucose. So as glucose and cholesterol form, it gets a little stickier, and then it can build. You can even see there's a layer of plaque already in here. It's very important, right? But it can get stuck and built. Now, I want you to think about a garden hose. If a garden hose is really big, let's just use a big hose, and you turn the water on, chances are if the water coming into it is like this big and your hose is this big, it's going to kind of trickle out, right? As you make the hose smaller and the water level stays the same, it's going to come through the hose a lot faster. There's more pressure, okay? So your arteries are able to expand. They have flexibility. But what happens when you get these plaque buildups is they lose that flexibility. They become a little harder, right? They're limited and restricted, and the hose gets even smaller. And what research has found is as that hose gets smaller and it becomes less flexible, it actually can scar. It can actually cause scarring and even more hardening. And so, again, some of this is absolutely normal and healthy, but once this gets a little layer right here, that part right there, that covering, once it becomes big like this, it can send information as if you are injured. So macrophages and all of those inflammatory cytokines, anybody in science here would know what that is, but you don't need to worry about it. They send the message, oh, we have something wrong. Let's try to heal this. And it creates a plaque layer on the top. Okay. So it's like a scarring. Okay. Think of it like when you cut yourself. So I have a cut right there. Macrophages, histamines, all went in there to help rebuild that skin. So now I have a thicker layer. So as this gets larger, this plaque right there, there is this cap that it's like a scar on the top that forms over the top of this. And it can be really inflammatory. So it just perpetuates, right, this kind of hardening of the arteries. Ultimately, over time, as you heard the physician say, the expert in this area, over time, then you have problems. Blood vessels fill up, irregular heartbeat. So it does not discriminate, right? So your arteries feeding the heart, feeding the lungs can get full of plaque. Okay, we already did that. We already talked about that. Okay. So you don't need to remember this, but if you're going to take an at phys or just physiology, you do need to understand this. Or if you're going into dietetics or nursing, just take note. Okay. LDL cholesterol, really important. While paired with high blood sugar, promotes this a stickier cholesterol, right? And it can cause these more than normal kind of clumps. The immune system, like I just said, treats it as if it's an invader, and it infiltrates the wall of the artery and releases pro-inflammatory cytokines. Those are inflammatory markers. So you can look those. You can get blood tests. What are your inflammatory markers like? Okay. This signals for other cells to come remove the cholesterol from the artery wall, but it ultimately ends up forming a cap. What do we got here? So a fibrous cap forms over the plaque. Inflammation inside the plaque, because it's active, can eventually eat away at that fibrous cap. Now, this is where we have our problem. So pay attention. When someone dies of a stroke or has a stroke, what that means. Does anybody know what that means? Before I answer it. Don't look at the list that I'm about to go through. Does anybody know what a stroke is? Or have you all heard of a stroke? Okay. So one of those really built up fatty plaques, right? Let's just say that fibrous cap breaks. What happens is that cholesterol globular fat pocket now gets released into your bloodstream, and it can clog very important arteries, right? To the brain. So now you're not getting blood to the brain. You're not getting signals to the body, right? That's a stroke. So this is where your blood, all of these clustered of symptoms, blood pressure, a high resting blood sugar, right? High intensity stress. All of these things over years can put you at high risk for stroke and heart disease and heart attacks and other problems. Okay. So when that fibrous cap breaks and you get a fatty deposit now all clumped together, floating through, it can clog and create problems, right? They suddenly spill into the artery, causing a blood clot to form and block blood flow. If even a little plaque, one not large enough to block blood flow by itself, suddenly ruptures, it can stop blood flow completely. Kind of a big deal. So this one is stable. It's kind of dead. This ain't going to go anywhere. You can see this has been fine. I mean, of course, you're going to have a higher blood pressure, right? Because your hose got smaller, maybe smaller than the actual, amount of blood wanting to get through. But these are active, right? Smaller, thinner caps. And that's where we get problems right there. It ruptures. Okay. Any questions? Let's talk about it.
Cholesterol is essential for good health. This waxy, fat-like substance is produced naturally, mainly in your liver, but it also comes from the food you eat, like eggs, fatty meats, and cheese. Cholesterol is a key component for critical functions. Your skin uses cholesterol to convert sunlight into vitamin D. Some glands need it to make hormones such as estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol. Cholesterol helps your liver create fat-dissolving bile acids, which help with digestion. And it's a crucial building block in every cell membrane. Cholesterol doesn't dissolve in blood, so it needs special proteins to help move it through the bloodstream. These lipoproteins wrap themselves around cholesterol molecules and deliver them to where they're needed most. There are two main types: high-density lipoproteins called HDL, and low-density lipoproteins called LDL. Most of the body's cholesterol is made up of LDL, also known as the bad cholesterol. When too much of it builds up in your bloodstream, it sticks to artery walls, helps form plaque, which can lead to heart attacks or strokes. HDL is considered the good kind because it acts like a scavenger, absorbing excess cholesterol in your blood and taking it back to your liver, where it's flushed from your body. It's important to monitor your cholesterol levels regularly so you can help keep your HDL high and your LDL low.
Good enough. That makes sense. So we need both cholesterol. They're very important. They both do really important things. Problem is when there's an imbalance and you add to that high blood pressure, right? You add to that higher blood sugar because of the breakdown of glycogen under fight or flight situations, or over consuming sugar while you're under stress, right? You add all of those things together and you're going to end up having a lot higher LDL, which is the cholesterol that is associated. It doesn't mean it's all bad. It's just when you have more and more paired with high glucose, it ends up becoming really sticky and causes all those plaques, right? Over here. So your cholesterol is produced largely inside your body, right? So even if you consume cholesterol, it's got to break down, it's got to digest. It does not mean that cholesterol is necessarily created into plaque. However, if you look at blood, how the blood responds to a really high fatty meal, cholesterol skyrockets, as it digests, as it emulsifies in the gut. Your cholesterol levels are going to go really high. But a lot of what you're producing, you can see right here, is actually in the liver. Okay? So it's not just what you eat. To just focus on that solely isn't painting the whole picture. It's an important part of the picture, but it's taking away all of those social determinants and political determinants and the fact that people have food insecurity and they're under high stress for long periods of time, right? When you take into this big picture, just because you're trying to eat differently, probability is it's not going to do a whole lot if you do not tend to the underlying stress loads and levels that people actually affects this right here. Okay. So most of your cholesterol is actually coming from your liver. It's a really important process. And then the rest, 20 to 30 from food intake. So keep that in mind when you're hearing, well, you need to change your food intake. Well, yeah, it's true. But there's a big chunk of information that needs to happen as well. So overemphasis on food actually can be a harmful thing, especially when you add, if you're saying to someone, you can't have a cheeseburger, and that cheeseburger is a novel thing that you used to do with your parents every Friday, and now you're not allowed to have a cheeseburger. What do you think that person's going to do when they get access to a cheeseburger? They're going to want more than they should. So again, look at the whole human when you think about these food recommendations. Many of them do not take into account the whole person and how we process information about access to food, especially food that we connect to belonging, that we connect to novelty and pleasure. Okay. This is kind of a cool way to look at, oh, it's, the hyperfixation on food actually has kind of a lot of unintended consequences, especially when it's really only accounting for 20 to 30% of our cholesterol, overall cholesterol. Okay. So the liver upregulates and downregulates to accommodate cholesterol ingestion by food. That is super freaking cool. Do you guys understand what this means? It is like the thermostat. When you eat food and it's got higher amounts of cholesterol, the liver says, hey, we don't need as much. It adjusts. It is dynamic with that. So that's, honestly, the human body is amazing. Okay. It's amazing. So hydrophobic lipoproteins, that's like what they said. When you have that wax buildup, you can put a protein cover. Now it's more deliverable to where we need it to go. Okay. So that's where the high density lipoprotein, or HDL, which is typically considered a really great scavenger of cholesterol because it takes it back to the liver to be processed. And then LDL takes what I'm pretty sure, and again, correct me if someone knows this, but I'm pretty sure what your LDL cholesterol does is it delivers to the body. So it takes it to the cells that need it. Let me just look at my picture. Yes, and then turn to phone cells that deposit, okay, in the plaques, but that's not all it does. Cleaved off. Okay, I think it's in the next one. Yeah, I knew this. I was right. Oh my gosh. I don't know why I question myself. I think that's healthy though, right? Don't you guys think it's healthy to question yourself? I don't know it all, and this is not my specific area of expertise, but it's an important conversation. Okay. Because right now you don't have problems. You're more likely to get murdered. You're more likely to actually commit suicide than have a heart attack. But you know what? Your parents, and give it 20 more years. You guys are going to be like, ooh, what's your cholesterol? I cannot wait for you guys to remember this and go, oh yeah, I remember that one professor. She was kind of crazy, but she told me 20 years from now, it's true. Just remember that. Okay. You're going to care. Give it 20 years. So the HDL takes it, right? That's a high density lipoprotein, and it takes it to the liver. And then your LDL, right, takes cholesterol and delivers it to cells, because it's very important. Cholesterol is super important. It's a building block of your cell membranes, every cell in your body. So that LDL is just as important, right? It's just how much do we need, and is it paired with sugar? So this brings us back to this conversation about stress. Increased cortisol, right? That's the brain part of the endocrine system. It's not, so when you perceive threat and you get that rush of cortisol and epinephrine and adrenaline, you get decreased protein uptake. Okay. So your body's like, well, we need to not repair right now. It's shunted to the liver to be created into glucose. On top of that, you have gluconeogenesis, which comes from glycogen. Increased release of free fatty acids from adipose tissue. That is leptin induced, right? Beta oxidation, increase in blood sugar, okay? All of this increases insulin. If that blood sugar is not used, if you do not fight, if you do not flee, you're going to end up needing to convert that into a glycerol, right? And insulin is a very important part of taking that glucose, and you end up, there it is, converts it to glycerol. increasing cholesterol, specifically LDL cholesterol. So stress-induced cholesterol is really a big deal. So when someone is under chronic stress, chronic fight or flight, you're going to have high LDL, okay? I do not care if you're a low gluten keto, you're going to have high cholesterol just by the sheer fact that you're going through this cortisol pathway through perceived threat. We'll listen to this quickly. I'm going to speed this up.
Medication for high cholesterol and you watch your diet, there is one risk factor that can sabotage all your efforts to control your cholesterol level: stress. Here to tell us more about this important piece of your heart health is Dr. Stephen Kopecky, a preventative cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic.
That's the
Welcome,
same
Dr.
physician.
Kopecky. So nice to have you with us. So tell us exactly how stress leads to cholesterol levels, including LDH cholesterol and triglycerides, rising.
Well, stress does a couple of things. First, it leads us to eat less well, eat more fattening foods, not be as active physically, exercise as much, and gain weight. But the other thing that stress does, even if you control your diet, control your activity, is that it's what's called the flight or fright phenomenon. Meaning when we get stressed, we put sugar into our bloodstream because it helps us run away from our enemies or whatever our attackers may be. That sugar then is converted into fat and deposited. It's in our bloodstream, it's deposited in our fat, deposited in our arteries. So it can lead to problems in a couple of ways.
So if we have chronic stress, we're constantly in that fight or flight mode.
Right, exactly. And that if you watch the evening news, if you have a family, if you have a job, if you have kids, I mean, all these things can lead to stress. And what we find often is people say, well, I like the stress, doctor, I live with it, I eat and breathe it. Say, well, you might, but it actually does cause problems with your arteries.
Okay, so remind us, what are the other factors that can lead to high cholesterol, which of course, we must remind our viewers, leads to heart disease?
Well, a lot of things can lead to high cholesterol. As you may be aware, recently the new nutrition guidelines said we don't need to worry so much about cholesterol in our diets. And that was kind of a double-edged sword in that what we do these days is we eat a very high saturated fat diet. It may not have cholesterol in it, but it leads to our cholesterol going up because of our diet. And even things like coconut oil, palm oil will raise our cholesterol levels. And so I have many patients now taking that, thinking it helps them reduce their wrinkles, their joints feel better or whatever. But the diet can clearly lead saturated fats in the diet. It doesn't just have to be red meat or foods with cholesterol in it.
All right, so diet, of course, we shouldn't be smoking, but what about this stress? What advice do you give your patients who are experiencing chronic stress?
Well, first off is to realize you have it. You know, we all are exposed to stress, as I said. If you have a job, family, kids, you know, everybody doesn't have a happy Thanksgiving with in-laws and ex-marriages, things like that. It can be very difficult. And just understand that it does affect you. Number two is try to find ways to relax. Try to find a few minutes in the day, a couple of times a day that you can relax. Try to get up and move around. It's been shown that if you'll move around for 30 seconds every 30 minutes, it will reduce your levels of blood sugar in your bloodstream. It'll reduce your insulin levels, reduce your triglyceride levels. So that's important.
That's
And
very
then finally,
Okay, I'm going to move on. Good enough. Any questions about that? Oh, so this is the 2019 heart disease map. I need to update this. But we saw the 2022-23 one earlier. It looks kind of like this. I will say, though, that it's kind of spreading in terms of the issue. Okay. I like to go back to Maslow's hierarchy. Where do we have the most poverty? Where do we have the most difficulty, environmental stressors? So it isn't necessarily just psychological stress. Let's just say that you're chronically sick, right? That can actually create a similar response physically, right? Just environmental impact of horrible air quality. It could be even sound. What is it called when it's like sound pollution? Where there's tons of sound that actually can create kind of a biological reaction of stress, right? Diurnal rhythms, not enough sun exposure. So when we take the whole human together, when they say, hey, if you're under stress, go work out. Well, yeah, of course, go work out because you're actually getting the fight or the flee part, and it utilizes some of that cortisol, stimulated blood glucose release, right? So you're actually giving it the feedback. However, how many of you here, when you are in kind of panic and your whole body is on fire in terms of fight or flight, are like, I'm feeling really motivated to go exercise? assuming you have that assumes you can afford where you're going to go, that you're feeling safe if you're going to go out and run, right? That you actually have time and energy to devote to that, right? It's kind of a luxury to be able to go exercise when you're stressed, right? I've been under a huge amount of stress, and exercise is not what I'm thinking about. I have all of this knowledge, all of the training, all of the years and years of working with people, and I'm here to tell you, I do not want to go exercise when I'm actually in real stress. It's just, I might want to go for a walk. I might want to stretch, but it's not necessarily fight or flight equivalent, right? Because there is this processing part of our minds and how we handle these things now that we're not in the wilderness, right? So it is as much as like the recommendation, go exercise, meditate, work on your breathing. All of those are really important and actually do matter and actually show for improvements. But when you think about the groups of people who have access to facilities that have it on call, like I'm an on-call coach, right? I help people. I actually do cognitive behavioral therapy techniques with clients that pay me, and I'm on call and they're distressed and I'm immediately available for them. Do you know how much they pay me for that? Like that's helpful for their fight or flight response, but they got to pay a lot of money to have me available. Does that make sense? So again, big picture, how do we help people? How do you help yourself under extremely stressful situations in a way that actually can calm you down? Sure, I would obviously say go freaking hike and scream and punch something. Yes, go do the fight and flee and then try to handle it later. Okay, we're gonna watch this real quick. I am gonna speed it up.
Now discovered, some of us possess a heightened biological defense mechanism, resulting in a more emotionally sensitive, more stress-reactive heart. In Scotland, a long-term population study into the psychological, social, and biological determinants of ill health is finally discovered live.
You know what? I
Chronic
think I need
disease
to
is a
slow
large
down.
disease of deprived communities, whether you're in the United States or in Europe or in the UK or in Glasgow.
An expert in vascular biochemistry, Professor Chris Packard is the study's chief investigator. He has focused on an important social pattern.
Where our professors and retired bankers live, stroke and heart disease is almost unknown. Those in the poorer areas die 20 years earlier than those in the more affluent areas. And the main cause of death is coronary heart disease.
Did you guys understand that? Got a really big accent. Did you guys?
Although it's a country famous for an artery clogging diet, it has little to do with the chip, the pint, or the smoke. In the second half of the 20th century, Scotland experienced tragic economic and social upheaval. Statistically, this is when their heart problems began.
The rise in heart disease in the 1950s is strongly associated with change in socioeconomic patterns in society. The 1950s, particularly in West Central Scotland, heavy industry collapsed, and the people that were left were unskilled, no hope of employment, living in communities that gradually deteriorated in quality of life and so on. So that for 50, 60 years, we've had communities that have been living with hopelessness.
What we're looking at is that there might be a common cause to not only heart disease, but also to a negative mental aspect.
The study is now testing this hypothesis that heart disease could be caused by the unhappy emotional experience of growing up in poverty.
When we were designing the study, we said to ourselves, what we need to do is to recruit from the affluent and deprived parts of town about 300, 350 people, which would be enough to test things like how much vascular disease did they have in the carotid arteries, what were their bloods like, did they have high levels of inflammatory factors, also the psychological profile. Can you make sense of the world around you? Do things distress you, and therefore do you have a super response to distressing elements, or do you deal with it quite calmly?
The data gathered so far is strong enough to draw some early conclusions.
The pathology goes from bad early life experiences or adverse conditions. As an adult, you have a more aggressive inflammatory condition in your body, and that manifests itself as heart disease.
A whole generation of Scots has been born into deprived, stressful, even dangerous conditions. Their inflammatory defense mechanisms have been activated early and have stayed active. It has hurt their hearts deeply.
Chaotic circumstances, difficult families, seems to send signals to babies' brains to suggest that, well, the world is a slightly dangerous place out there. Therefore, you need to enlarge the centers of the brain that are associated with the stress response.
Scotland's long-term population studies, combined with advances in psychobiology, are redefining core beliefs about the human heart. That at the very least, it is an organ sensitive and reactive to our emotions. One that, in a sense, has feelings.
Okay, so do you think that we should take that population that lived in hopelessness and say, hey, go work out? That'll help. Let's reduce your sugar intake. Yeah. How do you think that's going to feel? This is why I mentioned earlier, notice he's looking at it in a microscope and he's saying, reduce your sugar, reduce your cholesterol, go work out, go meditate. Do you see what I mean by let's look at this from a bigger picture, right? That actually these perceptions of threat for chronic periods of time, specifically physiological needs, environmental stressors, and belonging are really important. So when do we say to someone, hey, you have high blood pressure, have you thought about self-love and self-acceptance? Might be helpful to you. Maybe giving yourself grace and lenience around the hardship that you're living. Does that make sense? Like, what's the solution in this case? Because the advice that that physician was giving, be it was evidence-based, is for rich people. It's really inappropriate for someone that grew up in poverty and hopelessness and depression and relational trauma in that environment, dangerous environments, right? People trying to survive. When you hear heart disease, the first thing that I hear when I'm like, oh, heart disease, chronic stress. And it doesn't have to come from impoverished environments. It can come from toxic family dynamics, being attacked by your own family, right? Being in codependency. Notice how smoking is absolutely biologically connected to heart disease, but who's smoking the most? Blue collar, hardworking, but low wage, can't make a living, difficult paying their bills, right? Just go into the layers and layers and layers of not just environmental stress, the coping mechanisms that might be creating temporary calm, right? Or people that don't have access to food, they end up going hungry. And then when they do have access, they overconsume in that moment, all the while still dealing with their stress. So my point in all of this was for, let's start with our like myopic wellness health industry kind of view of how to do this. You know, go do intermittent fasting and cold plunge. What's that going to do for these people in Scotland? Sounds a little ridiculous, because it is. I'm hoping you guys are like, oh my God, this was amazing. I hope. Okay. Now we're going to move into diabetes. How many of you would look at me and think, oh, she's got high A1C and her fasting blood glucose is right on the edge? Would you? Well, guess what? I have that. It's a propensity in my family. My grandma had type 2 diabetes, and my dad had type 2 diabetes. My uncle had type 2 diabetes. It's in the family gene pool for sure. However, my A1Cs, which is a more long-term and more better assessment of type 2 diabetes, elevates substantially under chronic stress for me. So my pancreas is very sensitive organ for me. And so I'm prone to type 2 diabetes. What do you think the wellness and the fitness industry, would they be surprised by that? Yeah, well, guess who's not? All the research on what I've described, right? Like, no, I don't eat poorly. I actually have really high HDLs and really low LDLs, and my total cholesterol is like 180. But my blood sugar tends to be at over 100 at baseline. It's been this way for years. That could be because of all the exercise, and it could be for a lot of factors. I don't need to take medication, but I'm here to tell you that when I am under stress, my body works perfectly. It does everything it's supposed to do to promote fat gain, to promote the things that need to occur for me to be able to live without food. Okay. Really efficient at it for whatever reason. So you cannot tell based on looking at someone what's going on. So multifactorial, just so you know, means there's multiple things that goes into this. It's not just one. And it typically begins years before the type 2 diabetes prognosis or diagnosis. Something to consider again, that when you have really high elevated blood sugar over time, that can really tax the Leydig cells of your pancreas where insulin is formed, and it can over time be permanently damaged. And in that case, there's really not much you can do besides really trying to reduce your blood sugar, right? Trying to reduce your stress ultimately, and your relationship with food too. Because what do you think in terms of diabetes? Remember, diabetes is an insulin misfunction. Means that your insulin, which normally goes and grabs the glucose so your brain doesn't get too toxic from too much sugar, converts it into a glycerol, right? That's that cholesterol that we talked about with the LDL cholesterol. But over time, that might tax the system. So diabetes is kind of a comorbid. It's like something that goes with it, right? Heart disease, diabetes, boom. Right. And we can also look at, again, the stress loads that those two pair together, and also genetics. Right. So again, I'm genetically predisposed on top of just my body works perfectly. I would just hope to reduce my stress load. I'll use another example. So last year I had COVID, and when I get COVID, it's just horrible. It's like a month of misery and hell. Come to find out I have an autoimmune issue, which is like, oh, well, no wonder. Besides that. And then during that time, because my immune system was so suppressed, I ended up getting salmonella. Salmonella will kill you. It is a very dangerous bacterial infection. You end up puking your brains out, but diarrheaing everything out, and you end up with all sorts of problems. What do you think my blood sugar was, not having eaten anything for days? It was super high. It's supposed to be that way, right? It's supposed to. That was a healthy response. So the blood work they did while I was dealing with salmonella, it was like diabetes center, but they know, oh, this person's under extreme stress. This is actually a healthy response. Okay. But imagine if that stress wasn't from a bacterial infection that was trying to kill me, and COVID trying to kill me, right? Imagine that blood sugar was there because, let's just say, my husband decided to leave me, right? That could be really traumatic. How that might impact my blood sugar equally, right? Something really traumatic that I may have a huge amount of blood sugar rising, and how that might impact over decades your pancreas, right? Where your insulin is produced, how that might impact that. Okay. So type 2 diabetes. There's a difference between type 1. Anybody in here type 1? That's congenital, right? That's typically at a young age. Those cells in the pancreas don't work, right? Type 2 is very specifically caused by chronic stress, okay? Paired with food consumption, lack of activity, all of those things that we cluster together when someone is under stress, okay? So this is a condition that results in too much sugar circulating in the blood, which what is your blood sugar regulated for? Your brain. And so if it's toxic, that's not good. And that can have an impact. It can actually be very dangerous for your nerves, right? It can damage your nerves. It does a lot of damage when you have too much blood sugar. And so if your insulin isn't properly working, you're over time more likely to have all sorts of other diseases. Okay. The pancreas does not produce enough insulin in this case, a hormone that regulates the movement of sugar into the cells, and the cells respond poorly to insulin and take in less sugar. So you end up having really too high blood sugar for your brain and for your immune system and for your nervous system. So here's a nice little picture. I don't know why this is shaking, but this is really shaking today. I think it's that. Okay. So your blood sugar increases, whether you eat sugar or you are stressed, and your blood sugar rises. Your pancreas then goes, oh shit, I'm going to release some insulin. Leptin also gets secreted. And it attaches to that glucose to protect the brain. That's why the whole point is to protect the brain from toxic levels of glucose. It gets converted into the glycerol strands. At rest, glucose levels remain stable, right? Your body has this kind of like multi-range thermostat from the high end to low end. It's this dynamic, constantly moving situation to maintain blood sugar. Okay. So over time, the pancreas will then produce less insulin, right? You get these spikes. In type 2 diabetes, this process doesn't work well. Instead of moving into the cells, sugar builds up in the blood. As blood sugar levels rise, the pancreas releases more insulin. Eventually, the cells in the pancreas that make insulin become damaged and can't make enough insulin to meet the body's needs. That is when there's really not much you can do. I mean, lifestyle is a big deal. Stress is a big deal. But you may need to forever at that point be very aware and give yourself insulin shots, right? So let's look at these factors. Once again, these are individual level inside a microscope. Doesn't really tell you the big story, right, of the human. Doesn't really solve anything. Of course, who do you think is drinking excessive alcohol? Someone's coping with stress they don't think they can handle. Obviously, high cholesterol levels that come with all the other things, high blood pressure, smoking, again, a coping mechanism. That, honestly, I wish was somewhere else because we know that that's a byproduct of all this, right? And then type 1 genetics and all of this ultimately. So when we look at these factors, who do you think, regardless of race, is going to have this? It's the people that don't have resources or who've been stigmatized and outcast. That is often the case as well. Type 2 diabetes is associated with higher risks of heart disease, right? Because of that higher blood sugar, increased cholesterol like LDL, and plaque buildup. Stroke, that's where the plaque buildup comes in, right? Neuropathy, that's a byproduct of too much blood sugar. Damage to and destroys the nerves, resulting in tingling, numbness, burning, pain, eventual loss of feeling that usually begins at the tips of the toes, fingers, and gradually spreads upward. So nerve damage is a big problem because you may not be able to feel your feet. So my father has type 2 diabetes. He has worked out his entire life. He is a supplement. He's addicted to freaking studying supplements. He has this whole pharmaceutical thing of supplements. I'm telling you, healthy wellness health pants. That's my father. He has type 2 diabetes and he cannot feel his feet. So that means if he hurts his foot and he ends up with some type of problem, he may not even know it's infected, or he might have issues driving, or he might have issues walking if he can't feel his feet. So you can see then the impact then would be falling, which then affects other things. This also affects the digestive system, right? And so incontinence can be a problem, or nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation. Nerve damage can also affect erectile dysfunction. There's a reason why certain news channels, all they do is try to sell erectile dysfunction pills. It's those rage stations, rage bait news channels. Not surprised they're selling this medication because of the fact that their viewers are probably in chronic fight or flight and have a high probability of heart disease and type 2 diabetes. I digress. May lead to chronic kidney disease. Again, your kidneys are really important. End-stage kidney cannot be reversed. Means that you're terminal. You're going to need kidney transplant and dialysis. Increased risk of cataracts and glaucoma, so losing your sight and vision, because the increased blood vessel damage because of high glucose. Increased of slow healing and skin conditions. Bacterial and fungal infections are a problem for people who have type 2 diabetes or who are under extreme stress for decades of their life. Hearing problems are most common with people with type 2 diabetes. Sleep apnea, like inflammation in the sinuses, lungs, the whole body. Obesity may be the main contributor for this one, but we all know that obesity is not a problem. Having a lot of body fat isn't a problem so much as the way that it gets there, right? Chronic inflammation, extreme levels of leptin, that fight or flight process, the whole cluster. I honestly, when I was your age, the amount of weight stigma that existed was so massive in the medical community that this was just seen as the all cause. It's not. It is like low. It's all of these other things that I've been describing. Okay, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is skyrocketed. I don't know if you guys know anything about Alzheimer's, the fact that people's brains shrink, they can't use, their brain basically starts to stop functioning. Type 2 diabetes is definitely linked with Alzheimer's, right? I think this is it. We're about done. One more video, lots of videos today, but it's entertaining, I hope.
At the dawn of time, our ancestors lived in a world of danger. When they were attacked by fear, it was a bad idea to stay calm. So whenever they saw danger, their brains sounded a stress alarm that put their bodies into action. This ability to feel stress got passed down to us in the modern age. The problem is that our brains can't tell the difference between a physical danger and a social or emotional danger. So they all stress us out in the same way. So today, although bear attacks are less common, stress is a much larger part of our lives. In 2018, a Gallup poll found that 55% of Americans felt stressed during a lot of the day, while 45% felt worried a lot. Stress can still be helpful when it helps us take on challenges, provided that we get some rest afterwards. But when stress lasts for a long time, without giving us a chance to rest, it can do serious damage to our body. It can increase our risk for diabetes or make our current diabetes worse. To see why, we have to ask, how does stress work? When the brain senses danger, it releases stress hormones that get the body ready for action.
You guys getting it?
Sugar rises.
Over and over again? Okay, good. Little bit of information just about our population. There's a lot that goes into this. So that's it. Any questions? Hey, don't forget your assignment on the hunger scale is due on Wednesday, and we will see you then.
Thank you.
You're welcome.